El Salvador, a small Central American country, has long been plagued by violence and instability. For decades, the country was synonymous with gang violence, its streets ruled by notorious criminal organizations such as IMS 13 Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. These gangs terrorized entire communities, exerting control over neighborhoods, extorting businesses, and engaging in brutal acts of violence against those who opposed them. The country's homicide rate was among the highest in the world, and for many Salvadorans, gang violence seemed like an inescapable part of life. However, in recent years, El Salvador has undergone a dramatic transformation. Through a combination of hardline policies, community initiatives, and international cooperation, the Salvadoran government has taken unprecedented steps to dismantle the power of these gangs and restore peace to its streets. The results have been nothing short of revolutionary, and El Salvador's experience has become a model for other countries grappling with similar issues of gang violence and organized crime. The rise of El Salvador's gangs.
Bukele first came into power in 2019, and for nearly 2 years, he's overseen a vast and brutal crackdown on gangs.
Human rights groups are dismayed, as are relatives, as more than 65,000 people have been arrested over the past year.
To understand how El Salvador managed to destroy its brutal gangs, it's important to first understand how these gangs came to power in the first place. The roots of the gang problem in El Salvador can be traced back to the country's civil war, which lasted from 1980 to 1992. The war devastated the country, leaving behind a legacy of poverty, trauma, and instability. In the aftermath of the conflict, many Salvadorans fled to the United States, seeking refuge from the violence and economic hardship at home. It was in the streets of Los Angeles that many of these displaced Salvadorans, particularly young men, found themselves drawn into the gang culture. Gangs like IMS 13 and Barrio 18 were initially formed by Salvadoran immigrants in the U.S. as a means of protection against other ethnic gangs. However, as these organizations grew in size and power, they became involved in more serious criminal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and murder. In the early 2000s, the U.S. government began deporting large numbers of gang members back to El Salvador, where they quickly established a foothold in the country, with little opportunity for legitimate employment and few social services to support reintegration. These deported gang members brought with them the violent culture they had developed in the U.S. Soon, IMS 13 and Barrio 18 had become dominant forces in El Salvador, engaging in brutal turf wars and terrorizing the local population. By the mid-2010s, El Salvador was in the grip of a full-blown gang crisis. The gangs had infiltrated nearly every aspect of society, from local businesses to political institutions. They extorted businesses for protection money, recruited children as foot soldiers, and carried out vicious retaliatory attacks against rival gangs and anyone who dared to stand up to them. The country's homicide rate soared, reaching 105 murders per 100,000 people in 2015, one of the highest rates in the world. For many Salvadorans, the gangs seemed untouchable, their power unchecked by law enforcement or government authorities. The government's response: a new era of hardline policies. Faced with escalating violence and public demand for action, the Salvadoran government began to take a much more aggressive stance against the gangs. In 2019, Nayib Bukele was elected president of El Salvador, and his administration quickly made combating gang violence one of its top priorities. Bukele, a young and charismatic leader, promised to restore order to the country by implementing tough, uncompromising measures to dismantle the gangs. Bukele's administration launched what became known as Plan Control Territorial, a multifaceted strategy aimed at both reducing violence and reclaiming gang-controlled territories. One of the most controversial aspects of this plan was the deployment of thousands of military and police forces to neighborhoods heavily affected by gang activity. These security forces were given sweeping powers to arrest suspected gang members, establish checkpoints, and patrol streets that had long been considered no-go zones for law enforcement. At the same time, the government cracked down on the financial networks that supported the gangs. Gangs like IMS 13 and Barrio 18 had become deeply involved in extortion, collecting millions of dollars from local businesses and using that money to fund their operations. The Bukele administration worked to cut off these revenue streams by freezing bank accounts, seizing assets, and conducting raids on businesses suspected of collaborating with the gangs. Perhaps the most controversial measure of all was Bukele's decision to push for the mass incarceration of gang members. El Salvador's prison system, already overcrowded and notorious for its brutal conditions, became even more strained as thousands of suspected gang members were rounded up and imprisoned. Bukele's government defended these actions as necessary to restore law and order, arguing that the gangs could not be defeated unless their leaders and foot soldiers were taken off the streets. In tandem with these hardline tactics, Bukele's administration also sought to address the root causes of gang violence. The government invested in social programs aimed at providing education, job training, and support for at-risk youth, those who were most vulnerable to gang recruitment. By offering alternatives to a life of crime, the government hoped to prevent future generations from being drawn into the gangs. A turning point. The success of Plan Control Territorial. Initially, many observers were skeptical of Bukole's approach. Critics warned that the heavy reliance on military and police forces could lead to human rights abuses and exacerbate tensions in communities already traumatized by violence. Others questioned whether mass incarceration was a sustainable solution, pointing out that previous governments had tried similar tactics with little success. However, as time went on, it became clear that Bukole's strategy was having a profound impact. Within just a few years of his administration's crackdown on the gangs, homicide rates plummeted. By 2022, the country's murder rate had fallen to just 18.1 per 100,000 people, the lowest level in decades. For the first time in years, many Salvadorans felt safe walking the streets of their neighborhoods. Businesses that had once lived in fear of extortion were able to operate freely, and local residents no longer had to worry about being caught in the crossfire of gang violence. The Salvadoran government also made significant progress in reclaiming gang-controlled territories. Entire neighborhoods that had once been considered off-limits to law enforcement were now under government control. The security forces, once viewed with suspicion by the local population, began to earn the trust of communities that had long felt abandoned by the state. Perhaps most importantly, the government's efforts to address the underlying social issues that fueled gang violence began to bear fruit. By offering educational opportunities, job training, and support for young people, the Bukele administration helped steer thousands of potential recruits away from the gangs. In some communities, former gang members even participated in government-sponsored programs aimed at reintegration into society, providing a glimmer of hope that the cycle of violence could be broken for good. The future of El Salvador's fight against gangs. Despite these challenges, El Salvador's success in dismantling its brutal gangs has captured the attention of the international community. Other countries in Central America and beyond that are grappling with similar issues of gang violence and organized crime are now looking to El Salvador as a model for how to address these problems. Nations like Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, which have struggled with gang violence for decades, are closely watching the Salvadoran experience to see if Bukele's approach can be replicated in their own contexts. At the same time, Bukele's government is facing new challenges as it seeks to build on the progress that has been made. While the reduction in homicides and the reclamation of gang-controlled territories are significant achievements, there is still much work to be done to ensure that the gains are sustainable. The government must continue to invest in education, job creation, and social services to prevent a resurgence of gang violence, while also working to reform the country's justice system and prison conditions. One of the key lessons from El Salvador's experience is the importance of a multifaceted approach to combating gang violence. While hardline tactics such as mass incarceration and aggressive policing can help bring immediate relief to communities, they must be accompanied by long-term investments in social and economic development. By addressing the root causes of gang violence, poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity, governments can break the cycle of violence and create lasting peace. For El Salvador, the dismantling of its brutal gangs has been nothing short of a national transformation. Once considered one of the most dangerous countries in the world, El Salvador is now on the path to a brighter and more peaceful future. While challenges remain, the country's experience offers hope to other nations facing similar struggles with organized crime and violence. El Salvador's fight against the gangs has changed everything, and the world is watching.